Everyone in the village of Thornbury knew what a proper cot looked like. A proper cot had walls of wattle and daub, hazel rods woven between upright stakes, plastered over with a mix of clay and dung and chopped straw until the surface was smooth enough to shed rain. One layer of wattle, one coat of daub, finished. The method had built every peasant dwelling in England for as long as anyone's grandparents could remember. It was not a method you questioned, because the questioning of things that had always been done that way was not a luxury that villains of Thornbury Manor had much occasion to afford. The method was also, as Aldrich the Thatcher's son had been observing for 20 years, while he worked on the outside of everyone else's walls and roofs, profoundly indifferent to the cold. A properly daubed wattle wall was slightly better than nothing. It stopped the wind. It kept the rain out if the daub was maintained and the gaps were filled each autumn. It did not hold heat. The heat from a peasant's central hearth rose to the roof and found its way out through the thatch in the same hour it was made, and the walls stood in the cold and passed the cold through themselves all night, and by morning the fire had to start from nearly the same temperature as the outside air. This was the condition of every cot in Thornbury, and it had been the condition of every cot in Thornbury since before the conquest, and nobody had ever thought to question it, because the questioning of walls was not the kind of thinking that a man who owed the manor 3 days of week work and additional boon service at harvest and a hen at Martinmas and his eldest son's best beast at death had much time to do. Aldrich had time. He had time because Haymond the Reeve, in the accounting of October in the year of our Lord 1314, had looked at the rolls and looked at Aldrich's 3 seasons of failed strips on the east field, the strips that the wet summer had drowned and the dry autumn had cracked and the cold spring before that had held dormant too long to ripen, and Haymond had done the arithmetic that Reeves did. The arithmetic was 3 years of reduced render from Aldrich's strips, the deficit accumulated against the Lord's account, the sum due now larger than 3 more years of good harvest could repay. The Lord's domain needed the strips back under productive management. Aldrich could remain in the village as a laborer. He could not remain with the strips. He could not remain in the cot that stood on the land attached to the strips. Haymond told him this on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in Aldrich's cot with the account roll in his hands, reading the figures in the flat voice of a man who was reading figures and not opinions. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who managed the Lord's manor at Thornbury, and who had watched Aldrich's strips fail for 3 years and had continued the roll forward each year at the Lord's instruction, and had arrived at Tuesday morning with the roll's conclusion. He said, "You may take what is yours, the tools of your craft, the household goods, the bedding. You may not take the grain store, which is counted against the debt. The cot must be clear by All Souls." All Souls was 12 days away. Aldrich was 43 years old, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of thatching work, with the particular calloused hands of a man who had handled hazel rods and straw and rope and wooden mallet since he was 8 years old. He had a daughter, Edith, 11 years old, who was standing in the corner of the cot when Haymond read the roll, holding a wooden bowl she had been washing, looking at Haymond and then at her father. He said, 12 days. Haymond said, yes. He paused. There is wasteland above the mill stream to the north, common land. You have right of enclosure for a cot on the waste, as any free man does. He said this without particular kindness or unkindness. It was information. He gave Aldrich information the same way he read the account roll, in the flat voice of a man whose job was figures. Aldrich looked at the cot walls he had helped his own father build 23 years ago, the wattle he had woven himself at age 20, and the daub he had mixed and applied and maintained for the years since. He looked at the account roll in Haymond's hands. He said nothing. Haymond left. Edith set down the wooden bowl. She said, "Father," he said, "we are going to build." She said, "Where?" He said, "North of the mill stream, on the waste." She said, "In 12 days." He said, "I have built faster." She said, "It is October." He said, "I know what it is." He had built faster. He had roofed a barn in 2 days when the harvest weather required it. He had wattled a fold enclosure in a single day with 2 men helping. He had been a thatcher and a craftsman of bent wood and woven rod since his father taught him, and the craft had gone into his hands the way crafts went into hands that had done them every day for 35 years, below the level of thought. But he had never built a cot that would hold its heat through a night in November on the Thornbury waste, where the north wind came down the valley from the high ground without obstruction, and found the mill stream and found every gap in every poorly chinked wall it could find, and took the warmth through those gaps as efficiently as water found a low point. He had spent 20 years on the outside of walls that did not hold heat. He knew exactly why they did not hold heat. He had been pressing his palms against the outside of wattle and daub walls in all weathers for 20 years, feeling the warmth leaking through them in winter, feeling the gaps in the daub that admitted the cold, feeling the single-thickness wattle behind the daub that transferred heat outward the way any thin material transferred heat outward, which was directly and without resistance. He had thought about this in the way a craftsman thought about the material he worked with, not as a problem to be solved, but as a property of the material to be understood. He had never thought about it as a problem to be solved because solving it was not his role. His role was to maintain the walls that existed, to redaub the gaps each autumn, to replace the stakes that had rotted, to keep the wattle sound. Now, standing in the cot that would be empty at All Souls, with 12 days before he needed to be sleeping somewhere warm enough to keep Edith from the cold that would kill her if it did not keep her warm enough, the property of the wattle wall that he had understood for 20 years became a problem. He thought about it for an hour, standing in the cot, while Edith began sorting what was theirs and what was the Lord's grain. Then he went to the millstream waste and looked at the ground. The waste north of the millstream was rough ground, unenclosed, used for common grazing by the village's few remaining cattle. The grass was grazed thin and the soil was damp from the millstream's influence, dark, heavy clay with the particular weight of ground that had not been tilled in long memory. It was not good farmland. It was the land the village had left as waste, because the better land was already in strips. He walked the waste for an hour, looking at the site and the angles. The mill stream ran east to west, and the waste was on its north bank, which meant the prevailing north wind had a clear run at any structure he put here. There was a rise at the western end of the waste, a low bank where the ground lifted 3 or 4 feet before the pasture flattened again, the remnant of an old field boundary or an earthwork. He could not tell which. The rise faced south. Its south face was sheltered from the north wind by the rise itself. He stood at the south face of the rise and looked at where the cot would go. Then he went back to the village and began gathering materials. He had 12 days. He had Edith, who was 11 and capable and did not waste his time with questions whose answers could wait. He had his thatching tools and his carpentry tools and his wattling tools, the full kit of a man whose craft was building, and he had the right to take hazel and willow from the common coppice, which was the right every man in the village had, and which gave him all the wattling material he needed. And he had a thought about the walls that had been sitting in his mind since Haman left that morning, a thought that was partly memory and partly observation and partly the particular kind of reasoning that a craftsman did when he had been looking at the same problem from the outside for 20 years and was now, for the first time, on the inside of it. The memory was this. 15 years ago, when he had been re-roofing the miller's barn, he had stripped the old thatch and found beneath it a layer of bracken that had been packed under the thatch as insulation, packed 2 hands deep, and then the thatch laid over it. The bracken was old, compressed by years of thatch weight above it, dry despite decades of winter. He had pressed his hand into it. It was warm inside, warm in a way that had surprised him, because the thatch had been off and the October air had been cold, and the bracken had been pressed between the old thatch and the barn's ceiling boards for so long it had taken on the warmth of the barn and was keeping it. He had told the miller, and the miller had said, "That is how my father built it." He said bracken between the thatch and the boards keeps the warmth in. He had said this as if it were not particularly interesting, as if it were simply what you did if you knew what you were doing. Aldrich had filed it away. The observation was this: the thatch on a well-built roof was not 1 layer of straw but many layers, built up to a depth of 2 feet or more at the ridge, packed dense but not solid, the stalks lying at a shallow angle that shed water while holding the layers above in place. A good thatch 2 feet deep was a mass of straw through which the wind could not pass and through which the warmth moved very slowly, slowly enough that a man sleeping in the upper part of a good thatched cot was noticeably warmer than a man sleeping at floor level, because the warmth had gone up and been held under the thatch. The thought was this: if bracken between the thatch boards and the roof kept the barn warm, and if dense thatch on a roof kept the warmth from leaving, Then bracken packed between 2 layers of wattle wall would keep the warmth in the wall the same way it kept the warmth in the roof. Not 1 layer of wattle with daub on the outside, 2 layers of wattle with a hand's breadth of packed dry bracken between them, and the daub on the outer face only. He had never seen this done on a wall. He had seen it done on a roof in the miller's barn, and understood in the moment of the miller's explanation that it worked, though he had not thought about why it worked. He understood now, standing on the Thornbury waste in October, looking at where his cot would be, why it worked. The bracken held still air in its stems and fronds and in the spaces between them, and still air did not carry heat the way moving air did. A hand's breadth of dry bracken with its millions of tiny air spaces was better than a solid wall of any material, because the solid wall had no air, and it was the still air that was the insulator. He had no word for this principle. He did not need one. He needed hazel rods and bracken, and 12 days. He began building on the Thursday morning, 2 days after Haman's visit. The site he had chosen at the south face of the rise gave him the earthen bank as his north wall's backing. He would not build a north wall from scratch. He would dig into the rise 4 feet in and use the earth itself as the north wall, the same earth that held the stable warmth of the deep ground through all seasons and gave back to the cot the warmth it held. On the south and east and west faces he would build his double wattle walls. The north face would be the hill. He dug the north face first, cutting the bank face straight and square with the spade, opening a room 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep into the rise, the earth walls rising 5 feet to where he would begin the roof timber. The earth he excavated he piled on the west and east sides of the digging, and he would use this excavated earth to form the outer base of the side walls later, a low bank of packed earth at the foot of each wattle panel that would seal the base against wind infiltration and rain splash. He drove the upright stakes into the ground at the south wall line and at the east and west wall lines. Stakes of cleft oak cut to 6 feet height, set at every 18 inches of wall length, pounded in to 2 feet depth with the wooden beetle. The stakes were in 2 rows, each row 12 inches inside the other, the gap between the inner stake line and the outer stake line a consistent 12 inches. He wattled the outer panels first, working east from the southwest corner, the hazel rods woven between the outer stakes in the overlapping chevron pattern his father had taught him, each rod bent over the stake rather than behind it to lock the weave. He worked fast, the way a man worked when 12 days was his deadline and the weather was his enemy. He wattled the outer south panel in a day, working from before light to after dark, Edith bringing him food and not interrupting the rhythm. The inner panels he wattled the following day. They were slightly smaller than the outer panels because the inner stakes were set closer to the room's center, and the inner panel was the surface that would face the interior, the surface that would absorb and reflect the hearth's heat. He wattled the inner panels with the same chevron pattern, but without packing them tight, leaving slight gaps between the rods, intentional gaps that would catch the rising warm air from the hearth and hold it in the wattle surface briefly before it traveled up toward the thatch. Between the 2 wattle panels, the 12-inch gap, he filled it with bracken. He had spent Wednesday, the day between Haman's visit and the start of building, collecting bracken from the heath ground above the village where the bracken grew in thick stands, the long-frond autumn bracken that was fully dry after the October frosts had taken the green from it. He had carried it in bundles on his back, Edith carrying bundles twice her size beside him without being asked, and they had piled it at the building site in a quantity he judged would fill the wall gap from base to eave. He packed it in sections as the wattling went up, section by section, the bracken rammed in with a blunt wooden rod until it was compressed to approximately the density of a thick thatched roof, dense enough that it held its shape when the rammer was withdrawn, but not so compressed that the air spaces were eliminated. Compressed too tight, bracken became a conductor of heat the same way any dense material did. The point was the air. The air had to stay still in the bracken spaces, and for the air to stay still, the bracken had to be dense enough to stop the air from circulating, but not so dense as to have no air at all. He had never read a text on this subject. He would not have been able to read a text on this subject. He understood it by the feel of the material under the rammer and by the memory of how the bracken in the miller's barn had felt under his hand, the compressed warmth of dry material holding still air, He packed the bracken to 12 sections of the full 12-inch gap across all 3 walls. Then he daubed the outer panels. The daub was clay from the mill stream bank mixed with dung from the Lord's byre and chopped straw from the stubble field. The standard mix, nothing unusual. He applied it to the outer panel faces only, pressing it into the gaps in the wattle weave and smoothing it over the surface with the flat board. The outer daub coat was weather protection, not the insulation. The insulation was behind it, in the bracken, in the still air, in the bracken's fronds and stems, and in the 12-inch depth of still dry-packed material between the 2 wattle faces. He left the inner wattle panels undaubed. They were rough wattle, the weave visible, and he intended them to remain so. The rough surface of unwoven wattle facing the interior was a better radiator of heat than a smooth daubed surface because the rods and spaces of the wattle captured the warm air rising from the hearth and held it briefly against the wall rather than letting it slide past. He had observed this on his own, watching how wood surfaces in a cot behaved around a fire, the way a rough wooden surface warmed faster and held warmth longer than a smooth clay surface. He built the roof over 5 days. The ridgepole and rafters from coppiced ash, the thatch from the common meadow where he had right of gathering. He built the thatch 2 feet deep at the ridge and 18 inches at the eaves, packing it the way a good thatcher packed it, dense enough to hold and shed rain, with a layer of dried bracken between the thatch and the ceiling boards because that was how the miller's barn had been done and he knew it worked. He built the hearth in the center of the earth floor, a ring of creek stones mortared with clay, raised 4 inches above the floor to create a slight draft under the burning wood and keep the fire from smothering itself. He did not attempt a chimney. There was no tradition of chimneys in a peasant's cot in England in 1314, and a chimney would have been one more thing to build in 12 days. The smoke went up through the thatch the way it always went up through the thatch. He built the door on the east end of the south wall, a timber door on wooden pegs, fitted with a wooden latch and a leather draft stop at the base. He moved into the cot on November 1st, the Feast of All Saints, 1 day before the All Souls deadline Haymond had given him. He moved with Edith and the household goods and the tools and the bedding, and they laid their sleeping mats on the earth floor near the central hearth, and he lit the first fire, and they ate salt fish and dried peas, and went to sleep in the new cot on the Thornbury waste. He did not know yet whether the walls worked. He had no thermometer, because no one in Thornbury had a thermometer, because thermometers were not yet a thing in England in 1314. He had what he had always had, which was his hands and his experience and his ability to tell a warm surface from a cold one. He woke before dawn on the first morning and lay on his mat in the dark and assessed what he could feel. The fire had burned down to coals in the night. The air in the cot was cold, but it was not the cold of a cot in November before the morning fire, which was the cold that woke you before you were ready because the air on your face was below the temperature at which sleep was possible. It was cold in the way that a room was cold when it had been unheated for several hours but retained the memory of the warmth it had held. A different quality of cold, the cold of a space that was warming slowly rather than losing heat as fast as the outside could pull it. He pressed his palm to the inner wattle face of the south wall. The wattle was warm. Not warm the way a surface near a fire was warm, but warm in the way a material was warm when it had absorbed heat over several hours and was holding it, the stored warmth of the previous evening's fire living in the dry rods and the bracken behind them. He pressed his palm to the inner earth wall of the north face. The earth was warm. The earth was always warm, this depth below the surface, carrying the stable ground temperature that did not change with the seasons, the warmth of the hill itself rather than the warmth of yesterday's fire. He lay back and thought about these two warmths and how they combined. The hill gave him a north wall at 50 degrees. The bracken walls kept the hearth's warmth from leaving through the south, east, and west faces. The thatch kept the warmth from leaving upward. What remained in the cot after the fire died was the warmth from 3 sources: the fire's direct heat, the hill's constant ground warmth, and the warmth that the bracken walls had slowed but not stopped, heat that was crossing the 12 inches of still air at a fraction of the speed it would have crossed a standard single-thickness wattle panel. He went outside in the November dark and pressed his hand to the outside of the south wall's daubed face. The daub was cold. The outside air was cold. But the daub was not as cold as the outside air. It was warmer than the air by several degrees, which meant heat was still crossing the wall from inside to out, as it always did, but crossing it slowly, the bracken slowing it down. The outside surface of the wall was not yet down to the outside air temperature because the heat was still arriving from inside, crossing 12 inches of bracken at the speed still air permitted. He went back inside. Edith was awake, sitting up on her mat with the blanket around her shoulders, looking at him. She said, "Is it warm enough?" He said, "It is not cold." She said, "It was warm when I woke." "Before you opened the door?" He said, "Yes." She pressed her palm to the inner wattle face beside her sleeping mat and held it there. She said, "The wall is warm." He said, "Yes." She looked at the wall for a moment. She was 11 years old, and she had the particular quality of attention that came from being the daughter of a craftsman who had explained his craft to her since she was old enough to carry a bundle of hazel rods. She pressed her palm flat against the wattle and left it there, reading the temperature the way her father read it, not just touching but measuring. She said, "Why is the wall warm?" He said, "What do you think?" She thought about it. She said, "The bracken behind it." He said, "Yes." She said, "The bracken holds the warmth in the wall so it does not all go through." He said, "The bracken holds still air. The still air holds the warmth. Still air does not let heat pass through it quickly." She said, "Because still air does not move." He said, "Yes. Heat moves on moving air. When the air does not move, the heat moves slowly." She pressed her palm to the wattle again. She said, "And the hill." He said, "The hill is warm on its own. The ground below us is warm all year. We have put the north wall inside the hill instead of outside it." She sat with this for a while. She said, "The standard cot." He said, "One layer of wattle with daub on it. The heat goes through one layer of wattle as fast as through wood of the same thickness. Wood is not a good insulator. The heat leaves through the wall and the wall is cold by morning." She said, "And our walls," he said, "have 12 inches of bracken that the heat must cross before it reaches the outside air." He paused. "Still air holds heat the way a thick blanket holds heat. It does not generate warmth. It slows the warmth down." She said, "How slow?" He said, "I do not know yet. We will find out in January." He was right that they would find out in January. But they began finding out much sooner than that, and the finding out was not only about the walls. November. The first person to notice was Thomas the carpenter, whose cot was 200 yards south on the wasteland, separated from Aldrich's by the small garden enclosure Aldrich had staked out for the spring. Thomas was the man who had built his own cot on the waste the year before, for reasons that were different from Aldrich's, but that had ended in the same place. He was 31, unmarried, and he was a carpenter's journeyman who had worked under the manor carpenter for 8 years and who had been building his own cot as a long-term project between his day work obligations. Thomas's cot was standard construction, good quality standard construction, the best single-thickness wattle and daub a man who knew his wood could build. It was warm by the fire and cold at night when the fire went down, which was the standard condition. He noticed the difference at dawn on the 3rd day of November, when he passed Aldrich's cot on his way to the day work in the manor fields and saw that there was no smoke from the roof thatch. No smoke from the thatch at dawn meant one of two things. The fire had been lit so recently it had not yet built, or the fire had not been lit yet because the night inside the cot had been warm enough to allow continued sleep. He knew both possibilities because he had lived in a cot all his life. He knocked. Aldrich was awake. He came to the door and Thomas looked at him and said, "Your fire is not yet lit." Aldrich said, "I have been awake an hour and the cot was warm enough to not need it yet." Thomas looked at him. He said, "Warm enough. In November." Aldrich said, "Come in." Thomas came in and stood in the center of the cot and held out his hands and turned slowly, assessing the air temperature the way a man who lived in cold spaces assessed warmth. He said, "This is warmer than my cot at dawn." Aldrich said, "Yes." Thomas said, "How?" Aldrich explained the double wattle and the bracken and the north face dug into the hill. He explained it the way he had explained it to Edith, in the plain terms of what the materials did and why. Thomas listened the way a carpenter listened to a building method he had not encountered, with the focused attention of a craftsman who was hearing something that might be important. Thomas said, "The bracken. It holds the warmth in the way thatch holds the warmth in a roof." Aldrich said, "The same principle. Still air does not carry heat. The bracken is full of still air." Thomas said, "How deep is the bracken in the wall?" Aldrich showed him the wall section at the door jamb, where the outer and inner wattle panels were visible in cross-section, and the bracken between them showed its depth and density. Thomas pressed his fingertips into the bracken pack from the door edge. He said, "Dense." Aldrich said, "As dense as good thatch. Not solid. Dense." Thomas pulled his fingers out and looked at the bracken particles on his fingertips. He said, "I have been buying wood from the Lord Steward at 4 pence a cord for 2 years. Aldrich said, "This is not going to eliminate your wood needs. It will reduce them." Thomas said, "By how much?" Aldrich said, "I do not yet know." He paused. "Come back in January and I will tell you." Thomas left. He came back on the first truly cold night in November, when the frost was hard by evening and the air had the particular edge that the earliest winter brought, and he knocked again, and Aldrich let him in. Thomas said, "My fire has been going since vespers, and my cot is not comfortable." Aldrich put his hand out and let Thomas feel it. The cot was 60 degrees, or what would be 60 degrees on a scale that had not yet been invented. It was warm enough that Thomas took off his outer cloak inside, the thing a man did in a warm room that he did not do in a cold one. Thomas stood in the warm cot for a while. He said, "I want to rebuild my north wall." Aldrich said, "Your north wall is standard construction. You would need to strip it and rebuild it with the double wattle and bracken infill." Thomas said, "How long?" Aldrich said, 4 days for a man who is a carpenter." Thomas said, "And the material?" Aldrich said, "Hazel from the common coppice and bracken from the heath. The hazel is free to any man with the right of estovers. The bracken is common land. Your materials cost nothing." Thomas looked at him. He said, "Nothing." Aldrich said, "Labor. Nothing else." Thomas rebuilt his north wall in December. 4 days of work, as Aldrich had estimated. He drove inner stakes alongside his existing outer stakes, wattled the inner panel between them, packed the gap with bracken from the heath, and left the inner face bare wattle the way Aldrich had done. He did not rebuild the east and west walls because they were sheltered by the lie of the wasteland, and because December was not the time for full wall reconstruction. One wall was enough to show him what Aldrich had known from November. He came to Aldrich's cot on the 4th morning after finishing and said, "It is warmer." Aldrich said, "Yes." Thomas said, "The north wall makes the difference because the north wall is where the wind finds the gaps." Aldrich said, "And the north wall is where the cold air sits against the outside face all night. The other walls have the wind load sometimes and not others. The north wall has it always." Thomas said, "I understand it now." He looked at the wall. He said, "I have been sleeping cold for 3 years because I did not know what to put between 2 layers of wattle." Aldrich said, "I did not know it either until I had to build a new wall." Thomas said, "The bracken was already known to insulate under a roof." Aldrich said, "The miller's barn. I re-roofed it 15 years ago and found bracken under the thatch. The miller said his father built it that way." Thomas said, "And nobody put it in the walls." Aldrich said, "Nobody needed to think about the walls. They had walls already." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "I am going to tell the priest." Aldrich said, "Why the priest?" Thomas said, "Because the priest has to build a new almonry at the south end of the churchyard before Easter, and he has been complaining that the old one is cold as a grave in December, and the bread stored there freezes solid." He said, "If the almonry walls are rebuilt with the bracken method, the bread will not freeze." Aldrich said, "The almonry has a north wall." Thomas said, "It has a north wall and a west wall, both facing the open ground." Aldrich said, 2 walls. A week's work for 2 men. Thomas said, "I am a carpenter with no day work obligation until the spring plowing." He looked at Aldrich. "You are a thatcher, with right of coppice and right of common." Aldrich said, "You are asking me to help rebuild the almonry walls." Thomas said, "I am telling the priest that you have a method that will keep his bread from freezing. What the priest does with that information is his own affair." What the priest did with that information was appear at Aldrich's cot the following morning. Father Crispin, a young man of 26 who had been the priest at Thornbury for 3 years, and who had spent all 3 winters watching the parish's charitable bread stores freeze solid and thaw and freeze again and become unfit for distribution, which was a problem that a priest with his bread distribution obligations felt acutely. Father Crispin looked at the cot walls with the attention of a man assessing a building method. He pressed his hand to the outer daubed face of the south wall. He pressed his hand to the inner bare wattle face of the same wall, which required going inside, and held it there. He said, "The inner face is warm." Aldrich said, "The bracken between the faces holds the warmth in the wall. The heat moves slowly through the bracken." Father Crispin thought about this. He had been educated at a cathedral school where some philosophy was taught, and he had Aristotle's categories somewhere in the back of his mind, and the category of insulating materials was not one he had thought about specifically, but the principle was not foreign to him. He said, "The bracken holds still air, and still air does not carry heat." Aldrich looked at him. He said, "Yes, Father, that is the reason." Father Crispin said, "I knew this." He said it with the slight defensiveness of a man who knew principles he had not applied. He said, "The philosophers say that air at rest conducts neither heat nor cold with facility." He paused. "I had not connected this to bracken in a wall." Aldrich said, "I had not connected it to Aristotle." Father Crispin said, "No, I imagine you had not." They built the almonry walls in 3 days. Aldrich and Thomas and Father Crispin himself working on the inner panels, while Aldrich did the wattle and Thomas mixed daub. The north and west walls were double wattled with bracken infill. The south and east walls were left as their original construction, which was adequate for the sides the sun touched. The bread in the almonry did not freeze that winter. Father Crispin mentioned this to the archdeacon when the archdeacon visited in February, noting it as a practical improvement to the parish's charitable function. The archdeacon asked what method had been used. Father Crispin told him. The archdeacon wrote it in his visitation notes, noting the bracken wall method, developed by a villain named Aldrich on the Thornbury Waste, applied to almonry walls with good effect. The archdeacon's visitation notes were copied to the bishop's register, where they remained for the next 400 years, forgotten, in the margin of a February entry. December. December in the year 1314 was the kind of December that arrived with the particular severity of a season that had been building for 3 years of bad harvests and poor summers, and the slow northern drift of the climate that the older people in the village called the cold creep, the sense that winters were harder and longer than they had been in their youth. The cold in December 1314 was not the worst that would come. The worst was coming in January and February of 1315, and in the years that followed, the years that the chroniclers would call the time of great hunger, the years when the rains came and did not stop in the summer, and the harvest rotted in the field and the cattle sickened, and the people of England and France and Germany and the Low Countries began to understand what it meant when the weather itself stopped cooperating. But December 1314 was bad enough. The temperature dropped sharply in the second week and held, the kind of sustained cold that frosted the village puddles solid and froze the millstream wheel and drove the livestock closer to the byres and made every gap in every wall in Thornbury visible as a line of frost on the inner surface of the wattle where the cold came through. Aldrich tracked the December cold the way he tracked everything, by hand. He pressed his palms to the walls at different times of day and assessed the temperatures they were giving back to him. He pressed his hand to the outer daubed face in the morning, after a night of cold, and felt what temperature the outside of the wall had reached. He pressed his hand to the inner wattle face and felt how much warmth the bracken had retained. On the coldest mornings of December, when the frost was heavy and the outside air was at the temperature of serious cold, the outer daubed face of his south wall was cold. Not as cold as the air, because heat was still moving through the bracken and arriving at the outer surface, but cold. He pressed it for a count of 10 and felt the cold on his palm. He went inside and pressed the inner wattle face. Warm. Not warm the way a sun-warmed surface was warm, but warm the way a stored thing was warm. The warmth of material that had been accepting the heat from the room for hours and was giving it back. He was doing what every person who ever measured a wall was doing, whether with hands or instruments, measuring the temperature gradient across the wall, the difference between the cold outside and the warmth inside, and reading in that difference how much work the wall was doing. He was not a natural philosopher. He did not use those terms. He pressed his hands to surfaces and felt what they told him and built from what he felt. What he felt in December told him that the double wattle bracken wall was doing what he had built it to do. The warmth was staying in the room, not all of it. Some warmth always left through any wall, but more of it was staying than left through a standard single wattle. Significantly more. He burned less wood than his neighbors. He knew this because he could see his own woodpile and count the pieces remaining, and he could see Thomas's woodpile 200 yards away and count Thomas's pieces remaining, and Thomas had begun with the same amount and was going through it at a noticeably faster rate despite the north wall rebuild that Thomas had done in December. Thomas had rebuilt only the north wall. The east and west walls were still standard single wattle. Some of the warmth that Aldrich's walls retained, Thomas was still losing through his east and west faces. Thomas's woodpile told the story of the difference. He said as much to Thomas in the third week of December when they shared a fire at Thomas's cot for an evening. He said, "Your east wall." Thomas said, "I know." Aldrich said, "The east wall is the problem now because the wind comes from the east in the second half of winter." Thomas said, "I know." He paused. "I do not have the time for it until after Christmas." Aldrich said, "After Christmas, the worst of the cold is still ahead of you." Thomas said, "I know that too." He rebuilt the east wall in the last week of December during the Christmas respite from day work, working alone with the tools Aldrich lent him, the hazel rods from the coppice, the bracken from the heath. He finished on the day of the Holy Innocents. Haman the reeve rode past on his rounds the following morning and stopped his horse at the edge of the wasteland and looked at Thomas's newly doubled east wall. He looked at it for a long time. Then he rode to Aldrich's cot and knocked. Aldrich opened the door. Haman was on his horse, which he did not dismount from, which was the posture of a man who had a question and not a visit. He said, "Thomas has rebuilt his east wall with the double wattle and bracken." Aldrich said, "Yes." Haman said, "The same as your walls." Aldrich said, "Yes." Haman looked at the south wall of Aldrich's cot, the outer daubed face. He said, "How does the building stand in the cold?" Aldrich said, "Warm enough." Haman said, "How warm?" Aldrich said, "Warm enough that Edith and I have been sleeping comfortably since November. Warm enough that I have burned half the wood Thomas has burned in the same period." Haman said, "Half." Aldrich said, "Less than half if he had not rebuilt his north wall." He paused. His east wall was letting out the warmth the rebuilt north wall kept in. The east wall rebuild should help further. Haman was quiet for a moment. He was doing arithmetic, which was what Haman did when confronted with numbers. He said, "The Lord's Hall." Aldrich said nothing. Haman said, "The hall solar is cold in winter. The north wall of the solar faces the open courtyard." He paused. "It has always been cold." He said, "The Lord's wife complains of it." Aldrich said, "The solar wall could be rebuilt with the bracken method. It would require stripping the existing plaster and adding the inner wattle panel and the bracken infill behind it. The outer face would be replastered when complete." He said, "The solar wall would hold its warmth through the night after a fire in the evening." Haman said, "And you are proposing to do this work?" Aldrich said, "I am answering the question you asked." Haman looked at him. He said, "The question I asked was how the building stands in the cold." Aldrich said, "It stands warmly." Haman was quiet again. He was a man who had been doing the manor's arithmetic for 12 years, and the arithmetic of the solar, which burned through wood at a rate that made the Lord's household complain each winter, was a problem he had been accounting for without solving. He said, "I will put the proposition to the steward." He rode away. The steward authorized the work in the second week of January, but January brought something else before the steward's authorization could be acted on. January brought the cold, not the December cold, which had been harsh but manageable. The cold that arrived in January of 1315 was a different kind of cold, the kind that the oldest people in the village recognized from their grandfathers' stories as the cold that arrived before a change, before a season of winters that were not like other winters. The temperature dropped below anything the village could remember and held there for 10 days. The mill stream frozen solid for the first time in living memory. The cattle refusing the outside of the byres and pressing together for warmth in the dark interior. 3 people died in the 10-day cold. The first was an old woman named Agnes the fuller's wife, who was 62 years old, and who had lived alone in her cot since her husband died in the summer, and who had been burning her way through a wood supply that was not adequate for the cold she was now facing. She was found by her neighbor Marjorie on the 5th day of the cold snap, sitting by a cold hearth in the position of a person who had gone to sleep in her chair and not woken. Her wood supply had run out on the fourth day, and she had either not known to ask for help or had been too cold to reach the door to do it. The second was a young man named Will the Plowman, 20 years old, who had been working the demesne in the field gangs and who had gone to bed in his cot on the 7th night of the cold snap and had not risen. His cot was on the exposed north side of the village, a single-room wattle and daub structure with no particular insulation, and the cold on the 7th night was the worst of the 10 days. He had not died from freezing in the dramatic sense. He had gone to sleep in a cot that was too cold to sustain a person at rest through the night. The third was a child. The third was Cecily, the 6-year-old daughter of Martin the shepherd and his wife Joan, who lived in the village proper in a standard cot on the north side. Cecily had been ill before the cold arrived, a chest sickness that the village healer had been treating with dried herbs and steam. The cold of January settled in her chest in the way that extreme cold settled in a weakened chest, and on the 8th night of the cold snap, Joan had run through the frozen dark to Father Crispin's door, because Cecily was breathing badly and her lips were wrong. Father Crispin came to Aldrich's door before he came to Martin's cot. He knocked in the dark at past midnight, and Aldrich opened the door, and Crispin said, "There is a child with chest sickness in the cold, and she is turning blue at the lips, and the parent's cot cannot be kept warm enough." Aldrich said, "Bring her here." He went back inside and built the fire up, feeding it with the better hardwood he had been saving, feeding it to a full burn, and not a moderate one. He cleared the best sleeping mat to the space nearest the fire and piled the blankets on it. Joan came in carrying Cecily wrapped in everything they owned, which was not warm enough. Cecily was 6 years old, and she had her mother's dark eyes, and she was breathing in the shallow, quick way of a child whose lungs were fighting something, and her lips had the bluish cast that meant the cold had joined forces with whatever was in her chest. Aldrich had Edith sit beside the child and hold the blankets around her from all sides while the fire built. He went to the south wall and pulled the bench away from it. The south wall's inner wattle face was warm, radiating the stored heat from the previous evening's fire and from the warmth that had been building in the cot since he opened the door for Father Crispin. He moved the sleeping mat against the south wall and had Joan carry Cecily there. He said, "The wall is warm. It is radiating heat. Have her press her back against the wattle." Joan looked at him. She pressed her own hand against the wattle and felt the warmth, and then she put Cecily against the wall and sat beside her with the blankets wrapped around both of them. The warmth from the wall hit the child from behind, and the warmth from the fire hit her from the front, and the warmth from the cot in general. The ambient warmth that the bracken walls had been building and holding through the night wrapped around all of them. The blue faded from Cecily's lips. It faded in the time it takes a hearth to build to a good fire, 40 minutes, an hour. The warmth arriving at the surface of the skin and moving through it to where the cold had been sitting. Joan said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "She is warm." Aldrich said, "Yes." Joan pressed her face into the child's hair and held it there. She said, not lifting her face, "Your walls." Aldrich said, "Yes." Joan said, "Haman took your strips." Aldrich said, "Yes." She lifted her face and looked at him. She said, "And you brought us here." He said, "You knocked at my door." She said, "Father Crispin knocked." He said, "Someone knocked. It does not matter who." Cecily slept against the warm wattle wall for the rest of that night and the next day and the night following, Joan sleeping beside her, Edith bringing them food from the pot over the fire. The cot was full of people, and the fire was burning well, and the temperature in the small space was higher than it had been since Aldrich built it, the bracken walls holding the warmth from 5 bodies and an active hearth, the hill behind the north face keeping the worst of the cold from that quarter. On the second morning, Father Crispin came back. He came in and looked at Cecily, who was sitting up and eating the pottage Edith had made. He pressed his hand to the south wall. He stood there with his palm flat against the wattle for a long time. He said, "Agnes, the fuller's wife, burned her last wood on the 4th day." Aldrich said, "I know." Father Crispin said, "She was 62 years old. She had been on the north side of the village for 40 years in the same cot." He paused. Will the Plowman was 20. Aldrich said, "I know." Father Crispin said, "They died in standard cots." Aldrich said, "They died in cots that could not hold the warmth." Father Crispin said, "And this cot held it." Aldrich said, The bracken holds still air. The still air holds the warmth. He said these words again, and they were the same words he had said to Edith in November, and to Thomas and to Crispin himself, when the almonry walls were being rebuilt. He said them the same way each time, because they were the same truth each time, and the truth did not require embellishment. Father Crispin sat down on the bench near the fire. He said, "The bishop has sent a letter regarding the winter." Aldrich said, "What does the bishop say?" Father Crispin said, "The bishop says that many parishes are reporting increased cold this winter, and that the pastoral response to the suffering of the poor is a matter of urgent attention." He paused. He said, 3 parishes to the north have reported deaths in the cold snap." Aldrich said, "More than ours." Father Crispin said, "Yes, more than ours." He was quiet. Then he said, "Haymond." Aldrich said, "What about him?" Father Crispin said, "Haymond gave you 12 days in October." Aldrich said, "Yes." Father Crispin said, "And you used those 12 days to build this." He gestured at the cot, at the walls, at the sleeping child against the warm wattle face. Aldrich said, "I used them to not freeze." Father Crispin said, "You used them to build something that kept a child from dying in a cold snap." Aldrich said nothing. The priest sat by the fire for a while longer, and then left to say his office. Haymond came to the cot on the 6th day of the cold snap, which was the last truly severe day before the temperature moderated slightly. He came to the door and knocked, and Aldrich opened it. He was not on his horse. He was on foot, which was unusual for Haymond, who rode his horse as a function of his station. He said, "I have come to see the cot in the cold." Aldrich let him in. Haymond stood in the center of the room. Joan was there with Cecily, who was recovered enough to sit up on the mat with a blanket, still not fully well, but no longer blue at the lips, no longer breathing in the shallow, frightened way. Edith was there, and Father Crispin had come back. And Thomas was there because Thomas had been spending evenings at Aldrich's cot for warmth and company since December. Haymond looked at Cecily. He looked at the fire, which was moderate, not the large fire a standard cot needed for this cold. He pressed his hand to the inner wattle face of the south wall and held it there. He said, "This wall is warm." Aldrich said, "Yes." Haymond kept his hand on the wall. He said, "Agnes died on the 4th day of this cold snap. Will the plowman died on the 7th. He was speaking to the room, and to no one in particular, in the same flat voice he used for the account roll. He said, "They were in standard cots." Nobody said anything. Haymond took his hand off the wall. He looked at Aldrich. He said, "The solar." Aldrich said, "Yes." Haymond said, "I spoke to the steward. He authorized the work." He paused. "The material is free from the common resources?" Aldrich said, "Hazel from the coppice and bracken from the heath. Nothing purchased." Haymond said, "And the labor?" Aldrich said, "I will do it." Haymond said, "At what rate?" Aldrich said, "At the rate of a skilled craftsman, which is what I am." Haymond looked at him. He said, "The rate of a skilled craftsman is 4 pence a day." Aldrich said, "I know the rate." Haymond said, "It is not the rate I have been paying you for day work since October, because day work is not skilled craftsman work." Aldrich said, "No." Haymond said, "I will record it at 4 pence." Aldrich said, "I also want right-of-way to the north coppice for my wattling material for the next 3 years." Haymond said, "You have Estovers right in the common coppice already." Aldrich said, "The north coppice has better hazel than the common coppice. I want the north coppice right for 3 years in exchange for the solar work and for the almonry work I did in December." Haymond thought about this. He said, 2 years. Aldrich said, 3. The almonry work was a winter in materials already given. Haymond was quiet for a moment. He said, 3 years. Aldrich said, "Yes." They did not shake hands. That was not how agreements were made between a reeve and a villain in 1315. They both acknowledged the agreement by being still for a moment and not contradicting it, and then Haymond left. Thomas said, "The north coppice." Aldrich said, "Yes." Thomas said, "That is the best hazel in 3 parishes." Aldrich said, "I know." Thomas said, "Haymond agreed to it." Aldrich said, "The Lord's wife is cold. Haymond has been accounting for the wood consumed in the solar for years. He wants the solar warm. He wants it warm more than he wants the north coppice." Thomas said, You have been thinking about this since October. Aldrich looked at him. He said, since Haymond read the roll. February came and did not bring relief. The winter of 1315 was the beginning of what the years would make clear was not a single hard winter but a change in the character of winters in England and across northern Europe. The summer that followed was wet beyond reason, the rain coming in July and August when it should have stopped and the harvest standing in the fields and drowning rather than ripening. The summer of 1316 was the same. The years afterward were the years of the Great Hunger. The years when the chronicles recorded the dying of people in numbers that had not been seen since the plagues of earlier centuries. But in February 1315, standing at the beginning of this time without knowing what it was the beginning of, Aldrich finished the solar wall at the manor house, the inner wattle panel and the bracken infill and the replastered outer face, 3 days of work at 4d. a day, and the Lord's wife slept warm in the solar for the first time in 3 winters. The Lord's steward noted this in the household accounts, not with any philosophical commentary, but with the practical notation that a permanent improvement had been made to the solar's thermal performance and that the wood consumption in the hall complex had decreased by a measurable amount in the last weeks of February compared to the previous year's February record. The Lord, who was not a man given to particular interest in the construction methods of his manor's buildings, had his steward find Aldrich and ask him, "Is this thing you have done to the solar wall the same as you have done to your own walls on the waste?" The steward delivered the question to Aldrich, and Aldrich said, "Yes, my lord, it is the same." The Lord had the steward ask a second question, "Can you apply it to the chapel?" The chapel was on the north side of the manor courtyard, a single nave structure with a north wall that admitted the full force of the winter wind through its original plaster and lath construction, which was older than the current lord's grandfather, and was maintained only by annual replastering. Aldrich said, "Yes, my lord, I can apply it to the chapel." He applied it to the chapel in March, when the cold was finally beginning to release its grip, and the chapel was warmer the following November before anyone needed to light a fire in it than it had been in any November anyone could remember. Father Crispin noted this in the parish record for the year 1315, in the account of the improvements to the chapel fabric. A new method of wall construction was applied to the north wall of the chapel under the direction of Aldrich, formerly a villain of this manor, and now free craftsman of the waste, by which dry bracken is packed between 2 layers of woven wattle rod, the inner face left bare and the outer face plastered with daub. The effect is to hold warmth in the building through the night after a single evening fire. The method was first used by the same craftsman in his own dwelling on the waste in October 1314 and has since been applied to the almonry walls, the manor solar, and the chapel north wall. The record also noted in Crispin's careful Latin that in the severe cold of January 1315, 2 parishioners had died in their cots while a child with chest sickness survived in the warmth of Aldrich's cot on the waste. Crispin had been educated enough to add a marginal note in the same Latin that he believed the principle of the bracken wall was the ancient philosophical observation that still air resists the passage of heat, which was known to the ancients and had apparently been discovered independently by a thatching craftsman on a Lincolnshire waste who had pressed his hands against too many cold walls over too many winters to not know what a warm wall should feel like. If this story made you think about the difference between knowing a principle from books and knowing it through your hands, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And I want to know this. Have you ever solved a problem not because you knew the philosophy behind it, but because you had felt the problem through your hands for so long that the solution arrived before the words for it? Because Aldrich had pressed his palms against cold walls for 20 years and felt what was missing before he had any way to name what it was. When the 12 days came, his hands knew what to do. The cot on the Thornbury waste stood for 60 years. It was rebuilt twice in that time, once after a roof fire in 1347, the year the Black Death came through the county and took 1/3 of the parish, and once after flood damage from the mill stream in 1389. Both rebuilds used the double wattle bracken method on all 4 walls because by the second rebuild, the method was the standard for cots on the waste, which was a small patch of England where cold walls were no longer considered unavoidable. The bishop's register entry, copied from the archdeacon's visitation notes of February 1315, described the bracken wall method in terms specific enough that a reader could build it. The register was consulted 17 times in the following century by clergymen and manor stewards looking for solutions to cold buildings, and each of the 17 consultations produced a set of rebuilt walls in a parish somewhere in the Midlands. Aldrich died in 1361, which was the year of the second plague visitation, though his death was not from plague, but from a chest weakness that had been with him since the wet winter of 1316. He was 90 years old, which was an age that was considered remarkable in the 14th century and is still considered remarkable in any century. He died in the cot on the Thornbury Waste, on the sleeping mat against the south wall, with his hand pressed against the inner wattle face as it had been against the inner wattle face on the first night of November 1314. The wall was warm. He had pressed his hands against cold walls for 20 years before he understood what a warm wall needed. After November 1314, he had pressed his hands against a warm wall every morning for 47 years. He had built it. He had pressed his palms to the bracken-filled wattle the morning after the first night and felt the warmth there, the warmth of still air holding what the fire had made, and he had known then that the 12 days had been enough. The bracken holds the still air holds the warmth. That was all there was to it. That was everything.